He was pushing a janitor's cart through a service corridor when he heard it, a sound that had stopped a room full of engineers cold. A $2.5 million hypercar. A live investor demonstration. A CEO whose reputation was bleeding out by the second. And not one expert in that building could figure out what was wrong. But Malik Carter could. He hadn't even walked through the door yet. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning Sterling Automotive planned to change the luxury car market forever started the way all important mornings do, with too many people in expensive suits pretending they weren't nervous. The company's headquarters sat on the edge of the city like something out of an architectural magazine, all glass and steel and deliberate angles. The main showroom occupied the ground floor, a wide-open space with floors so polished you could read a contract in their reflection. Investors had flown in from 3 different time zones. Camera crews from 4 major automotive publications had set up their equipment 2 hours early. Catering staff moved carefully between clusters of people who kept checking their phones, even though there was nothing new to check. The Aurelius X9 sat at the center of all of it, covered by a matte black cloth that did nothing to hide the shape underneath. You could tell, just from the silhouette, that this was not a car designed for the highway. It had been designed for a statement. The low roofline, the widened haunches, the way the cover draped over the front end like it was barely containing something. Everything about it said this machine was made to make people stop talking. Evelyn Sterling stood just off to the side, reviewing something on a tablet her assistant held. She was 51 years old and carried herself the way people do when they've stopped needing to prove things to strangers. She wore a dark blazer, no jewelry beyond small earrings, and her natural hair was pulled back in a way that was both professional and entirely her own. Sterling Automotive was her company in the truest sense. Built from a design firm, she started with 2 employees and a belief that luxury should mean something more than a price tag. 12 years later, that belief was worth $2.5 billion on paper. The Aurelius X9 was supposed to make it worth considerably more. "We're at capacity," her assistant Marcus said quietly, glancing toward the press section. "Standing room in the gallery." "Good," Evelyn said, without looking up. She handed the tablet back and walked toward the podium near the covered car. The room quieted in that natural way rooms do when someone with actual authority moves through them. A few camera flashes went off early. Victor Hale stood near the engineering bay entrance at the far left of the showroom, flanked by 2 members of his team. He was the kind of man who wore confidence like a second shirt, broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with the certainty of someone who had spent decades being the smartest engineer in every room he entered. He had overseen the X9's development for 3 years, and he watched the room fill with the satisfaction of someone whose work was about to be applauded. Evelyn reached the podium. 12 years ago, she began, I walked into a dealership and asked about customization options on a $200,000 vehicle. The salesperson smiled and told me my choices were color and interior stitching. A quiet ripple of knowing laughter moved through the room. We built Sterling Automotive because luxury should mean something more than a price tag. Today, we're proving it. She nodded at Marcus. He pulled the cover from the car in one smooth motion. The Aurelius X9 was extraordinary. Deep midnight blue, with bodywork that looked less designed and more discovered, as though someone had found this shape already existing in the world and simply revealed it. The interior was visible through the low-set windows, all dark leather and precision instrument clusters. $2.5 million of engineering and craft sitting still under showroom lights. The applause started before anyone consciously decided to applaud. Evelyn walked around to the driver's side, opened the door, and settled into the seat with the ease of someone who had sat in this car hundreds of times. The room held its breath. She pressed the start button. The car made a sound. It was not the sound anyone in the room was expecting. It was a metallic clicking, quick, sharp, rhythmic, the kind of sound that didn't belong anywhere near a $2.5 million hypercar. It lasted maybe 4 seconds and then stopped. The engine did not turn over. The Aurelius X9 sat completely still. Evelyn pressed the button again. The clicking returned. Then silence. The room did not react immediately. The first few seconds were a collective refusal to process what had just happened. Then the whispers started, moving through the crowd the way smoke moves, low, spreading, impossible to stop once it had started. Victor Hale was already moving. He crossed the showroom floor at a pace just below a run, which in front of 200 people was almost worse than running. Two engineers followed him. He leaned into the driver's side window, said something quietly to Evelyn, and she stepped out of the car with the kind of controlled calm that takes years to develop. "We're going to take a brief intermission," Marcus announced from the podium, his voice steady. "Refreshments are available in the East Atrium. We'll reconvene shortly." The crowd moved toward the refreshments, but nobody was thinking about refreshments. In the engineering bay, just off the showroom floor through a heavy set of doors, the situation was not improving. Victor's team had connected the car to their full diagnostic system within minutes. 3 screens displayed real-time data from every system in the vehicle: engine management, electrical, fuel delivery, transmission, safety interlocks. Victor stood over the primary technician's shoulder and stared at the readouts. "Everything reads nominal," the technician said. Her name was Diane, and she had been with Sterling Automotive for 6 years. She had the careful tone of someone delivering news they themselves couldn't explain. "That's impossible," Victor said. "The system says all engine parameters are within normal range. Fuel pressure nominal. Ignition system shows no fault codes. ECU reports no errors." Victor straightened up and looked at the car as though it had personally insulted him. "Run it again." Diane ran the full diagnostic sequence again. The results were the same. One of the other engineers, a younger man named Preston, crouched near the front wheel well. "Could be a grounding issue. Sometimes the carbon fiber. The carbon fiber doesn't affect the starting circuit," Victor said. "Should we try replacing the ECU?" Diane asked. Victor hesitated for exactly 1 second. "Do it." They pulled the ECU and replaced it with the identical backup unit they kept on site. The process took 11 minutes. They reconnected everything and tried the ignition. The clicking sound returned. Victor turned away from the car and pressed both hands flat against the nearest work table. Behind him, through the small porthole window in the bay door, he could see the blurred shapes of investors still milling around the atrium. "There is no mechanical reason this car should not start," Diane said quietly. She was not being argumentative. She was simply stating a fact, and the fact made no sense. "Then why isn't it starting?" Preston asked. Nobody answered. Outside the engineering bay, in the wide service corridor that ran along the back of the building, Malik Carter was pushing a janitor's cart past a row of storage lockers. He was 38 years old, medium height, with the kind of build that comes from years of physical work rather than any gym. He wore the gray uniform of the cleaning contractor that serviced the Sterling Automotive building, Apex Clean Solutions, the name stitched in blue thread above his left breast pocket. His cart carried the usual equipment: mop, bucket, cleaning solutions, a folded stack of microfiber cloths. Walking beside him was his daughter Aaliyah. She was 9 years old, small for her age, with her hair in 2 puffs and her school backpack still on because she'd come straight from the after-school program. He couldn't afford the extended care that ran until 6:30, and bringing her with him was easier than the alternative, which was not having an alternative. Aaliyah had been coming to work with her father long enough that she knew the routine. She stayed close, stayed quiet where quiet was required, and did her homework on whatever surface was available. She had learned to read the building the way her father had taught her to read everything else, by paying attention. Malik slowed as they passed the heavy doors that led into the engineering bay. The corridor curved slightly here, and through the ventilation gap above the doorframe, sounds traveled in interesting ways. He had noticed it months ago, the faint echo of machinery, conversations, tool work. What traveled through now was the metallic clicking of a failed ignition. Malik stopped. He didn't mean to stop. It happened before the decision reached his brain. His body simply paused, the way a musician pauses when they hear a wrong note in a piece they know by heart. He tilted his head slightly toward the sound. The clicking came again. Same rhythm. Same sharp, interrupted quality. Aaliyah had stopped when he stopped. She was watching him now instead of the floor. "Dad," Chill. She shushed. She watched her father's face do the thing it did sometimes. The slight tension around his eyes, the stillness of someone who was very busy, doing nothing visible. She had seen this before years ago when a neighbor's car wouldn't start and her dad had stood in the driveway for a full minute just listening before he said, simply, the starter solenoid is getting power, but dropping it too fast. He'd been right. The clicking came a third time. Malik counted the rhythm under his breath. His hand had stopped on the cart handle, gripping it without pressure, the way you hold something when you've forgotten you're holding it. Aaliyah pulled gently at his sleeve. Dad, she kept her voice low. That sound isn't random. Malik glanced at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly, but recognition. His daughter had inherited something from him. He had always suspected it. Sometimes suspicion became evidence. He shook his head, slowly. This was not their business. He gripped the cart handle properly again and started moving. 20 feet down the corridor, a security guard named Terrence was making his rounds. He came around the corner and found a man in a cleaning uniform standing near the engineering bay doors with a child, both of them very still. Hey, this area is restricted during events. You need to be in the service corridor. Malik held up a hand. My fault. We're going. Dad didn't do anything, Aaliyah said. I know, sweetheart. We're moving. He steered the cart back the way they came. What Evelyn noticed was the expression on the man's face in the last moment before he turned the corner. She had developed, over 12 years of running a company, a sharp ability to read the faces of people who knew things they weren't saying. That man knew something. She walked faster. She caught them near the junction where the service corridor met the main rear hallway, a wide, plain stretch of wall with a water fountain and a recycling station. Malik was pushing the cart with one hand and helping Aaliyah find the right section in her homework book with the other. Excuse me. They both stopped. Malik turned around. Up close, he was younger than she'd estimated from a distance. The gray uniform was clean and pressed. He held himself with a quiet carefulness that she recognized, the particular posture of someone who has learned to take up exactly as much space as they've been given and no more. Evelyn looked at him carefully. Then she looked at the girl, who was looking back at her with open, curious eyes. You were standing near the engineering bay doors, Evelyn said. She kept her voice even, conversational. Listening. Malik met her eyes. I'm sorry about that. We were moving on. I'm not complaining about it. She paused. You were listening to the car. It wasn't a question. Malik didn't answer immediately. In the silence, the clicking started again from somewhere deep in the building. They could all three hear it faintly, traveling through the walls. Aaliyah looked at her father. The look said, you already know what that noise means. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. It just came out quiet but clear in the empty corridor. Dad, you already know what that noise means. Evelyn's attention sharpened in a way that changed the air around her. She looked at the girl, then back at the man. She had just come from 11 minutes of watching her best engineering team replace an ECU and achieve nothing. Come inside, she said. Tell me what you hear. Malik looked at her. Ma'am, I'm not. I'm the cleaning crew. I know what you are, Evelyn said. I'm asking what you know. She gestured toward the engineering bay doors. Come inside. The engineering bay felt different with the two of them in it. Malik pushed his cart to the side of the room and stood near the door, one hand resting on the handle like he was still deciding whether to stay. Aaliyah stayed close beside him, backpack on, eyes moving carefully around the space, the diagnostic screens, the expensive equipment, the hypercar in the center of everything. Victor Hale looked at Evelyn first. Then he looked at Malik. Then he looked at the cart. You're serious, Victor said. He didn't say it the way someone says something when they're genuinely asking. He said it the way someone says something when the answer they're expecting is going to give them permission to be furious. Start the car, Evelyn said. Victor didn't move for a moment. He had spent 3 years building this vehicle. He had a doctorate in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech and had published papers that other engineers cited. The idea that a janitor and his daughter were now standing in his engineering bay to weigh in on his car was not something his mind processed easily. Victor, Evelyn said, in a tone that ended the moment. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Victor nodded at Diane. Diane reached through the driver's window and pressed the ignition button. The clicking started immediately, for sharp, metallic pulses. Then silence. Then Diane pressed it again, the same thing. Malik's eyes were closed. He had closed them without deciding to, the same way he'd stopped in the corridor. He stood very still, head tilted a few degrees to the left, and listened. Not to the room. Not to the engineers muttering behind him or Victor's controlled breathing. He listened to the car. The clicking had a structure. It always did if you knew how to hear it. Most people heard the noise and moved immediately to solutions. But the noise was the information. You didn't fix the car by ignoring what it was telling you. He counted the pulses. He tracked the rhythm. He noted the way the second click was fractionally sharper than the first, the way the third and fourth blurred together at the end. His brain matched what he heard against a library built over years. Engines in rental yards. Engines in salvage lots. Engines in someone's driveway at 2 in the morning while they stood nearby, telling him the mechanic had already looked and couldn't find the problem. He opened his eyes. "Can you do that again?" he asked Diane. Diane glanced at Victor. Victor gave the smallest possible nod. Diane pressed the ignition again. Malik listened. He took one slow breath through his nose. "Okay," he said. Victor uncrossed his arms. "Okay, what?" Malik looked at the car. He spoke carefully, not because he was uncertain, but because he was choosing words for people who had spent this whole morning looking in the wrong direction, and he didn't want to say this in a way that made them defensive. The engine isn't failing mechanically. There's nothing broken in the mechanical system. The starter motor is receiving power. You can hear it engage. He pointed toward the front of the car, where the clicking originated. But it's being interrupted. Electrically. Very quickly. Maybe milliseconds after it gets the signal. Victor stared at him. The diagnostic shows no electrical fault. I know. Because it's not a fault in the traditional sense. It's more like... Malik paused. The system is being told not to start. Right after it tries. The room was quiet. That's ridiculous, Victor said. The diagnostic is comprehensive. If there were an interference signal of that kind. Did you check for external interference? Malik asked. Not internal faults. Something coming in from outside the car's own systems. Victor opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Diane turned back to her screen. Preston, who had been standing near the wall with his arms crossed, slowly uncrossed them. Meanwhile, Aaliyah had drifted quietly with the natural invisibility that children develop in rooms full of occupied adults toward the nearest diagnostic screen. She stood at an angle to it, not touching anything, just looking. She had been doing this since they walked in. She was watching the numbers the way her father watched cars, not looking for something specific. Malik nodded. There's a sensor near the ignition control module, a secondary input sensor. If this signal is coming in on that channel, temporarily disconnecting, it would isolate the interference. The car should start immediately. Immediately, Victor said, turning around. His voice an edge now. Based on listening. Based on what I heard and what your diagnostic just confirmed, Malik said. He kept his voice level. He had been in rooms where being right made people angrier than being wrong. You learned to stay calm in those rooms. Victor looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the car. Aaliyah, from her position near the diagnostic screen, said quietly, the signal appears every 3.2 seconds. It's on a cycle. Every adult in the room turned to look at her. She pointed at the anomaly log on the screen, with a timestamp showed the interference signal recurring at precise intervals. 3.2 seconds. Every time. It's not random. She looked at her father. Random things don't have patterns. Malik almost smiled. He had known she would notice that. Aaliyah had a habit of watching things the way her father did, cataloging quietly, waiting until something revealed itself. He had never taught her that. It was simply in her, the same way certain things had always been in him. Victor walked to the diagnostic screen and looked at the log. The timestamps were clear. 3.2 seconds. 3.2 seconds. 3.2 seconds, going back as far as the log ran. That's a programmed interval, Diane said slowly. That's not a mechanical oscillation. That's a programmed signal. Victor was quiet. Disconnect the sensor, Evelyn said. Ms. Sterling. Victor. She turned to face him fully. Disconnect the sensor. Preston moved to the car. He located the sensor Malik had described, a small secondary input component near the ignition control module, accessible through a panel below the steering column. He disconnected it in under a minute. "Try it," Evelyn said to Diane. Diane reached through the window and pressed the ignition button. The Aurelius X9 started. The engine sound was extraordinary, a deep, layered roar that built quickly to a smooth, powerful idle, filling the engineering bay with the kind of presence that reminded everyone in the room exactly why this car cost what it cost. It was alive in a way that the clicking silence had made impossible to imagine. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The sound filled the space completely. Victor Hale's face had gone the color of paper. Preston was staring at Malik with an expression that hadn't quite settled on anything. Diane had both hands flat on her workstation, leaning forward slightly, listening to the engine run. Evelyn turned to look at Malik. He was looking at the car. His expression was not triumphant. It was something more complicated, quiet, and slightly distant, like someone hearing a song they used to know. "How long has it been since you worked on cars?" Evelyn asked. "A while," Malik said. Aaliyah had her homework book out and was writing something down, as though the whole thing had been a very productive field trip, and she was taking notes. Evelyn dismissed the engineering team for a 15-minute break, which was a polite way of getting them out of the bay so she could think. Victor left last. At the door, he turned back once, and the look he gave Malik lasted exactly 1 second before he walked out. "You didn't touch it," Evelyn said, once the doors had swung closed and it was just the three of them in the idling car. "I didn't need to." She studied him. "Where did you learn to hear things like that?" Malik was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father was a mechanic. His father was a mechanic. I used to sit in the garage and listen to him work when I was her age." He nodded toward Aaliyah. "He always said the car tells you what's wrong. Most people don't stay quiet long enough to hear it. They start pulling things apart before they've actually listened." "You worked as a mechanic professionally?" "Among other things." He said it in a way that closed the door on further questions, politely but clearly. Evelyn accepted this. She was watching him with that particular attention she gave to problems she hadn't yet solved. The signal on that sensor. The programmed interval. That's not something that happens on its own. "No," Malik agreed. "That means someone put it there." Malik looked at her. "That's what it means." The car continued to idle, filling the silence with steady sound. Evelyn listened to it for a moment. Not the way Malik listened, but in the way people listen when they're very worried and the sound is the only thing in the room that isn't complicated. "I want to understand what we're dealing with," she said. "The other cars in development. We have 3 prototypes in the building right now. I want to know if any of them have the same issue." Malik looked at her carefully. "Ms. Sterling." "Evelyn." He paused. "Evelyn, I'm a cleaning contractor. I don't work for your company. I know that." She held his gaze. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to come back tomorrow. Not as cleaning crew. As someone who can hear what my engineers can't." Aaliyah looked up from her homework book. "I have a shift," Malik said. "I'll call your contractor and arrange coverage. I have my daughter. She can come." Evelyn glanced at Aaliyah. "She seems to be an asset." Aaliyah considered this compliment with the seriousness it deserved. "I want to see the other cars too," she said. Malik looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he looked at the car, still running, filling the room with proof that something had been wrong and something was now right. Then he looked at the floor. "One day," he said. "I'll come back for one day. To check the other cars." Evelyn nodded. "One day." She reached out and shook his hand, the way she shook the hands of engineers when they solved something that had been keeping her awake. Then she went to find her assistant to start managing the investors, who were still in the atrium with their drinks, waiting to be told that the $2.5 million car worked. Malik stood in the empty bay for a moment after she left, one hand back on his cart handle. The Aurelius X9 idled beside him, deep and steady. "Dad," Aaliyah said. "Yeah." "She believed you before the car started." Malik looked at her. "When you told her what was wrong," Aaliyah continued. "Before the test. She already believed you." She said it thoughtfully, like she was adding it to something she was tracking. Malik considered this. "You think that matters?" "I think," Aaliyah said carefully, zipping her backpack, "that it's easier to fix something when someone believes you about what's broken." They walked out of the engineering bay together, cart rolling ahead of them, back into the corridor where this had all started. Behind them, through the closing doors, the engine of the Aurelius X9 ran quietly and perfectly in the empty room. It had been waiting to run all along. It just needed someone to understand what was stopping it. In the control room upstairs, where the building's internal camera system ran on a loop of monitors, a figure sat watching the feed from the engineering bay. The footage showed the whole thing. The cleaning man closing his eyes, the sensor disconnect, the engine turning over, the CEO shaking his hand. The figure leaned back in the chair. Victor Hale pressed his fingertips together slowly. That janitor, he said to no one, just became a problem. The next morning arrived gray and cool, the kind of morning that makes everything feel slightly more serious than it needs to be. Malik dropped Aaliyah at school 40 minutes early because her teacher ran a reading group before the bell, and Aaliyah had decided weeks ago that she liked the reading group more than she liked sleeping in. He waited until he saw her go through the front doors, backpack bobbing, before he pulled away from the curb. He sat in his car for a moment after she disappeared inside. The heater ticked in that uneven way it had developed over winter, a rhythm he had long ago diagnosed and decided not to fix because the car still ran fine and the money that would go toward that repair could go toward other things. He was always doing that calculation. Everything in his life fit inside one calculation or another. He had spent most of the previous evening telling himself he wasn't going back to Sterling Automotive. He had cleaned the apartment, made dinner, helped Aaliyah with a worksheet on fractions, and at no point during any of that had he made peace with the fact that he was, in fact, going back. His body had already decided. His mind was still catching up. He knew this feeling. It was the same one he got when an engine made a sound he recognized, when something in him settled into the problem before he had consciously agreed to take it on. He drove across town. The engineering bay felt different in the morning. Quieter for one thing. The previous day's panic had burned itself out, and what remained was a kind of careful tension, the atmosphere of people who know something went wrong and are still figuring out exactly how wrong. Malik arrived in his own clothes this time. Jeans, a clean work shirt, boots that had seen better years. He had his contractor ID because the front desk had required it when he called ahead, but he kept it in his pocket. He didn't feel like wearing it around his neck. He found Evelyn in the engineering bay already, standing beside the Aurelius X9 with a coffee she wasn't drinking. "You came," she said. "I said I would." She nodded as though this confirmed something she had suspected about him. "The team is coming in at 9. I want to speak with you first." The engineers arrived in clusters. Some acknowledged Malik with a nod. Diane gave him a brief, professional one that said she was treating this practically. Others looked past him in the way people look past things they don't want to assign meaning to. There were 2 younger engineers he hadn't met before, both of whom glanced at him with undisguised curiosity and then at each other. He was used to that. He was used to walking into technical spaces in clothes that didn't signal the right things and watching people decide what to do with him before he'd said a word. Victor Hale arrived last, buttoning his jacket as he came through the door. He looked at Malik once, briefly, not the open appraisal of someone making a judgment, but the controlled acknowledgement of someone who had already made one and was now simply confirming. Then he set his bag down on his workstation and began pulling up screens. Evelyn addressed the room. "Yesterday we identified an external interference signal affecting the Aurelius X9's ignition control system. Today I want to know if that signal exists anywhere else in this building. We have 3 other prototypes in development. We're going to check all of them." She paused. Malik will be assisting. Victor kept his eyes on his screen. With the listening approach, Preston said, not unkindly, just clarifying. "With whatever approach works," Evelyn said. They started with the nearest prototype, a pre-production model called the Aurelius GT, a touring variant of the X9 with a different engine configuration. 2 engineers ran the standard diagnostic, while Malik stood nearby and listened during the ignition tests. He heard it on the second attempt. Fainter than the X9 had been, almost buried beneath the engine's normal startup sounds. But there, a fractional hesitation in the electrical rhythm, a place where the signal wanted to interrupt but hadn't fully activated yet, like something lying in wait. He said so. Diane ran the interference check. The alert came up in 40 seconds. Same channel? Evelyn asked. Same channel, Diane confirmed. Weaker signal, but the same architecture. They moved to the second prototype. Same result. The third showed nothing on the interference scan, and Malik heard nothing either. Clean. By the time they finished, it was nearly noon. The engineering team had gathered around the primary diagnostic station, looking at 3 separate anomaly logs showing the same interference signature in 3 different vehicles. This isn't a manufacturing defect, Diane said. She was not the kind of person who dramatized things, which made the statement land harder. This is the same code inserted deliberately in 3 separate vehicles. The room was quiet. Victor spoke for the first time that morning. We need to be careful about drawing conclusions. An anomalous signal could have several explanations. 3 vehicles with identical interference architecture is not several explanations, Evelyn said. It's one explanation. Victor said nothing. Malik was standing slightly apart from the group, near the wall. He had been watching Victor for most of the morning. Not obviously, not in a way that could be called staring, just the way you watch something when you're gathering information you haven't been asked for yet. Victor Hale was precise about everything. Precise in how he moved between workstations. Precise in how he asked questions, always framed as technical clarifications, never as genuine uncertainty. Precise, especially in how he responded to each piece of confirmation. The interference found in the GT got a small, tight nod from Victor, like a man crossing something off a list he already knew was there. The second prototype result got the same nod. Not surprise, not concern, recognition. Evelyn asked Malik to stay after the team broke for lunch. They sat in the small glass-walled meeting room adjacent to the engineering bay, just the 2 of them. You've been quiet, she said. I'm usually quiet. I mean about what you're thinking. She set her coffee down. She had replaced the earlier one and was doing a slightly better job of actually drinking it. You've been watching Victor all morning. Malik looked at her steadily. Has he always been like that? Closed off when things go wrong. Victor is always composed. That's part of why I hired him. There's a difference between composed and guarded, Malik said. He's guarded, like someone who already knows the answer and is waiting to see what everyone else figures out. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. That's an observation, not a fact. You're right. He didn't push it further. She studied him. You were going to say something else. He had been sitting on it since the second prototype test, turning it over the way you turn something over when you're not certain whether sharing it is wise or foolish. But she had asked. When I was listening to the GT this morning, he said, the interference pattern felt familiar. Not just similar to the X9. Familiar to me specifically. The way it's structured, the timing, the channel targeting, the way it stays below the standard diagnostic threshold. I've seen that approach before. He paused. I designed that approach. Years ago, at a different company. Evelyn set her cup down very carefully. Explain that. I worked as an automotive engineer for 8 years before I took contract work. My last position was at a company called Meridian Drive Systems. I developed a suite of engine diagnostic software, tools for detecting interference in electrical systems. Part of that work involved modeling how such interference might be introduced so we could build better defenses against it. It's the same principle as understanding how a lock can be picked so you can design a better lock. He stopped. That modeling was internal proprietary work. It was never published, never shared externally. When I left Meridian, it stayed there. But it's in this code, Evelyn said. The architecture is identical. I'm not saying someone copied a file. I'm saying someone who had access to my work used the same principles to build something designed to do the opposite of what I intended. The silence in the small room was different from the silences in the engineering bay. Smaller and more serious. What happened at Meridian? Evelyn asked. Malik's expression didn't change much, but something behind it shifted slightly, the way light changes when a cloud passes. I found a safety flaw in their flagship model. A real one, not theoretical. Under certain conditions, the engine management system could miscalculate throttle response at high speed. I reported it internally. The executives decided the cost of a recall was worse than the risk. He folded his hands on the table. When I escalated, they blamed the flaw on errors in my diagnostic software. Said I had introduced the vulnerability myself. I was terminated. The lawsuit went nowhere because they had better lawyers. Evelyn listened to all of this without expression. When he finished, she said, "And then?" "And then I raised my daughter," Malik said simply. She was quiet for a long moment. How old was she when this happened? 2. Outside the glass wall, the engineering bay was empty. The cars sat still under the overhead lights, patient, expensive, carrying their hidden signals like secrets. "Aaliyah doesn't know?" Evelyn asked. "She knows her dad used to work on cars. She knows he's good at it." A small pause. "She doesn't know how things ended. She's 9. Evelyn looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that she didn't try to name out loud. Then she said, "Someone took your work, Malik. Took it and used it to build exactly the thing you spent years trying to prevent. That's what it looks like. I need to know who." She said it with the particular flatness of someone deciding something they won't walk back from. "Not just for the company. I need to know who did this to you." Malik looked at her. He had not expected that sentence. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. Before either of them could say anything further, Aaliyah appeared in the doorway. School had ended. Marcus had picked her up per the arrangement Evelyn had made that morning, and she had apparently wasted no time coming directly to find her father. She looked at both of them, reading the room with the speed of a child raised to be perceptive. "Did something else happen?" she asked. "We're still figuring it out," Malik said. Aaliyah dropped her backpack on the nearest chair. "Then I'd better stay." The afternoon shifted into something different, quieter, more deliberate, with a focused energy that replaced the morning's broader investigation. Evelyn had cleared the engineering bay of most of the team after lunch. Diane remained, because she was the most technically precise person on staff, and Evelyn trusted her to keep what she heard to herself. Daniel Reeves, the company's operations director, arrived at 2, a tall man in his mid-40s, careful in his movements and his words, someone who had spent years making large organizations work smoothly. Evelyn had brought him in specifically because he had full system access and the kind of methodical patience that the next stage of work was going to require. Malik sat at one of the secondary workstations with Aaliyah at his elbow, close but not in the way. She had her homework out in theory. In practice, her pencil was resting on the page, and she was watching the screens. "The interference code appears in 3 vehicles," Evelyn said, standing at the head of the room. 2 questions. Who put it there, and what is it actually meant to do? We assumed yesterday it was designed to stall engines during demonstrations. I want to be certain that's all it does. Malik had been thinking about this since the morning. "May I look at the full code?" Daniel pulled it up. The interference code was not long. Maybe 200 lines, compact and precisely written, the kind of code that takes more skill to write briefly than to write at length. Malik read it slowly. He read a second time. He had the habit, developed over years, of reading technical documentation the way he listened to engines, without rushing toward conclusions, letting the full picture assemble itself before he said anything about it. Aaliyah watched his face. She could read the small changes in it the way other people read sentences. "This is different from what was in the X9, he said quietly. Diane looked up. "It uses the same interference architecture. The structure is the same. But this version has an additional component." He pointed at a section of the code, near the bottom, a secondary logic block that the X9's version hadn't contained. The X9 code was designed to prevent the car from starting. This version is designed to do that when the car is stationary. But if this trigger activates while the vehicle is in motion. He stopped. Daniel leaned forward. "What happens?" "The engine cuts out completely. No otherwise stowed. Instant shutdown, power steering, power brakes, everything that depends on engine power goes with it." He kept his voice even. "At high speed, that doesn't just stop the car. That creates a crash." The room absorbed this. Diane had gone very still at her station. Daniel stood up from his chair and didn't seem to know what to do standing, so he sat back down. Evelyn said nothing for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was controlled in the specific way of someone controlling it on purpose. "The vehicle's scheduled for demonstration. They're driven on track. At speed." "Yes," Malik said. "So if this code activated during a track demonstration, someone would die," Malik said. He didn't soften it. because softening it would have been dishonest about what they were dealing with. Or multiple people, depending on the vehicle and the conditions. The word die sat in the room and didn't leave. Aaliyah had stopped pretending to work on her homework. She was sitting very still, her pencil flat on the page, her eyes moving between her father and Evelyn. "This isn't corporate sabotage," Evelyn said slowly. "This is attempted murder. Someone is trying to kill your company," Malik said. "And if those cars run on track before this is found and removed, they'll do it by killing people." Evelyn called for a short break. Not because she needed one, but because the room needed air after what had just been said out loud. People got up and moved around without quite knowing where to go. Diane went to get water and came back without drinking it. Daniel stood by the window with his hands in his pockets and stared at the parking lot below with the expression of a man who had spent a career making sure things ran smoothly and was now processing the fact that something had been broken on his watch, inside his systems, using access he was partially responsible for granting. Malik stayed at the workstation. He scrolled back through the code slowly, not looking for anything new, just tracing what he already understood. This was a habit from his engineering years. When you found something bad, you sat with it long enough to be certain you understood it completely before you started telling other people what to do about it. Rushing toward solutions before the problem was fully seen was how you got solutions that didn't hold. Aaliyah slid her chair slightly closer to his. She looked at the screen. She couldn't read code, not yet, but she could read the shape of things, the structure of lines, the rhythm of notation, the same way she read the rhythm of a sound. "Dad," she said quietly, "the signal in the GT this morning, and the other prototype, you said they felt familiar." "They did. Like someone used your work." He looked at her. "Who told you that?" "Nobody. I was listening through the glass." She said it without apology. "I could see you and Miss Sterling talking. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see your face. You look like you do when something is both familiar and wrong at the same time." Malik was quiet for a moment. His daughter was 9 years old and reading his expressions through soundproof glass. He was not entirely surprised. He was, though, aware that there were things he had been carrying for a very long time that were now, slowly, becoming visible to her. "I made something once," he said, "to protect cars from exactly this kind of interference. Someone took what I made and flipped it inside out." Aaliyah thought about this. Her pencil tapped the page twice, slowly, like taking a lock and learning how to pick it from the inside. "You built it, so you know every tumbler." "Something like that." She nodded slowly. "Then whoever did this either knows you or knows your work." A pause. "Or they knew someone who knew both." Malik looked at her carefully. That last part was sharper than he'd expected. He had been thinking about the first two possibilities. He hadn't gone far enough yet to reach the third. When the team reassembled, Daniel had pulled up the system access logs, a full record of every login, every file accessed, every change made to the vehicle software in the past 18 months. Executive engineering access allows direct code uploads to vehicle software systems, Daniel explained. It bypasses the standard review queue. It was designed for emergency patches, the idea being that the chief engineer needs to be able to push critical fixes quickly without waiting for protocol. In practice, it's the kind of access that gets designed with good intentions and becomes dangerous when the wrong person has it. He paused. Only 3 people in this company have that level of access. He put the list on the main screen. Victor Hale, Chief Engineer Daniel Reeves, Operations Director Evelyn Sterling, CEO. Nobody said anything immediately. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm aware that I'm on that list. I want to say clearly, for the record, that I did not do this. And I'm also aware that saying that doesn't mean anything, technically. It means something to me," Evelyn said. She had known Daniel Reeves for 9 years. She did not believe he had done this. But she also understood that believing something and proving it were different activities. Malik had been looking at the access logs since Daniel put them up. Dates, times, login credentials, file modification timestamps. His eyes moved through the data with the same patient attention he gave to engine sounds, not rushing, letting the pattern emerge on its own rather than forcing it. Patterns always emerged if you gave them enough space. The modifications to the GT and the second prototype were made on different dates, he said. 6 weeks apart. Correct, Daniel said. But the login sessions are nearly identical in length. 22 minutes, give or take 1 or 2. Both sessions accessed the vehicle software files within the first 4 minutes and were otherwise quiet. No other files opened, no other systems touched. He traced the pattern on the screen. That's not someone working through a problem. That's someone executing a plan they had already written somewhere else and were now simply delivering. Diane looked at the logs. Both sessions originated from the same internal network node. Which node? Evelyn asked. Daniel typed quickly. The answer came up. Everyone looked at it. The modifications had been uploaded from the network terminal in Victor Hale's restricted laboratory on the 3rd floor. That doesn't prove Victor did it personally, Daniel said carefully. Someone could have accessed his terminal. His laboratory is keycard restricted, Diane said. The access log for the door would show. She was already pulling it up. The door log showed 2 entries on the relevant dates, both using Victor Hale's keycard, both at the same time as the software modifications. The room was very quiet. Evelyn stood with her arms crossed, looking at the screen with the expression of someone doing 2 things simultaneously, absorbing what the evidence showed and refusing to let it become the only thing she was considering. She was not a person who made decisions emotionally, and she was not doing so now. But she was also not a person who reduced everything to data. Victor Hale had sat in her meetings for 7 years. He had argued with her about engineering timelines, and won sometimes. He had built things inside this company that were genuinely brilliant. Before we do anything with this, she said, I want to understand the motive fully. Victor Hale has worked for this company for 7 years. He is extremely well compensated. He has built a significant part of what we've achieved. What did his brother offer him to do this? And why was it worth it? Aaliyah, who had been sitting quietly in the corner for the past 20 minutes, said, Who would make money if your company collapsed? 3 adults turned to look at her. She returned the attention calmly. That's the question, she said. If the cars fail publicly and people get hurt, and there are lawsuits, who wins? Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Daniel. Daniel pulled up his chair and started typing. Sterling Automotive has one major acquisition attempt on record. 14 months ago, Apex Motors made an offer to purchase the company for $800 million, significantly below market value. The offer came with a tight deadline and very specific terms around intellectual property transfer. It had the shape of something designed to be refused. He paused. The offer was rejected. I remember, Evelyn said. I rejected it personally. Apex Motors is run by Robert Hale, Daniel said. He said in a voice that was making itself neutral on purpose. He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the name on the screen. Robert Hale, Malik said. Victor's older brother, Evelyn said quietly. The room rearranged itself around this fact. Everything that had been a collection of suspicious anomalies and careful uncertainties clicked together into a single coherent thing. The same way a stalled engine resolves an emotion the moment you remove what was stopping it. If Sterling Automotive collapsed, if its flagship vehicles failed publicly, if people were injured, if lawsuits and safety investigations tore through the company's credibility, Apex Motors could purchase the wreckage for almost nothing. The technology, the patents, the manufacturing relationships, the client list that had taken Evelyn 12 years to build. All of it available at collapse pricing. And Victor Hale, sitting inside the engineering department with executive-level access and 3 years of intimate knowledge of every vehicle in development, had spent months building the mechanism to make it happen. Quietly, precisely, in sessions that lasted 22 minutes and left no obvious trace. He was going to let people die, Diane said. She said it quietly, like she was still deciding whether she believed it. He was going to arrange it so it looked like the cars failed, Malik said. Engineering failure, not sabotage. The investigation would have taken months. By the time anyone understood what had really happened, the company would already be gone. Evelyn stood very still for a long moment. Then she said, Does Victor know we're looking at this? Daniel checked the system carefully, pulling up a secondary log that tracked internal database queries, a record most people forgot existed. Someone ran an unusual access query on the anomaly logs this morning, about 2 hours after the team finished the prototype tests. He looked up. The query came from Victor's workstation. He searched the anomaly log directly, which is not a standard thing for the chief engineer to do. The standard process would be to receive a report. Running the query himself means he was checking to see what had been found without leaving a trace in the normal reporting chain. He knows someone is investigating, Malik said. He knows something flagged, Daniel said, correcting carefully. He doesn't know how much we've found. He doesn't know about this room or this conversation. Not yet, Malik said. Evelyn looked at him. He looked back at her. There was a question in her expression that wasn't quite formed yet. Something between what do we do now and can we stop this before it gets worse, and how do we do this without tipping our hand? Aaliyah was writing something in her homework notebook with quick, precise strokes, pressing the pencil down harder than her usual light touch. She did not look up when she said, "If he knows someone is looking, he'll move faster." Whatever he was planning to do next, the timing, the trigger, the demonstration, he'll try to collapse that timeline before you can get ahead of it. She looked up. Her expression was the same steady, uncomplicated one she used when she had worked through a math problem and arrived at an answer she was confident in. "How much time do you have before the next big demonstration?" Evelyn checked her calendar without hesitating. The global investor event. For days. Aaliyah looked at her father. Malik looked at the screens, at the access logs, at the name on the list, at the evidence that had assembled itself piece by piece from a sound he had heard through a door 2 days ago. For days. 3 vehicles carrying code that could kill someone. One man who had just learned that the walls were closing in and who was at this very moment somewhere in this building deciding what to do next. "We need to be very careful about what we do next," Malik said. "We need to do it fast," Aaliyah said. Both things were true, and the hardest part of the next 4 days was going to be holding both of them at once, in a building where the man who had built the danger was still walking the floors. The private office Evelyn used for after-hours work was small by her standards, a glass desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard she actually wrote on. She had cleared it of her usual materials and replaced them with printed copies of the access logs, the anomaly reports, and a timeline Daniel had built across the whiteboard in blue marker. 3 columns, 3 suspects. One by one, the evidence had done what evidence does when you give it enough space and light. The 3 suspects were also the 3 people with the access required to have committed what they now understood was not just corporate sabotage, but an attempted cover for what could have become vehicular homicide. Malik had ruled out Evelyn from the beginning. You don't sabotage your own launch unless you want to be ruined along with it. Daniel had placed himself on the list voluntarily and then stayed in the room, which was either the behavior of an innocent person or an extraordinarily confident guilty one. And Evelyn had decided after 9 years of working with him that it was the former. That left one name. It was past 9 in the evening. The main building had gone quiet except for the security rotation and the low hum of the engineering bay's climate system, which ran continuously to protect the prototype vehicles. Malik sat across from Evelyn. Daniel was at the whiteboard, marker in hand, adding a new notation. Aaliyah was asleep in the chair in the corner, jacket draped over her like a blanket. Homework books still open on her lap. She had lasted until 8:15 before her head began to dip. "The door log confirms Victor's key card on both modification dates," Daniel said. "The software modification timestamps sit inside the login window. The anomaly query this morning came from his workstation 14 minutes after the team concluded the prototype tests." He capped the marker. "Every thread leads to the same place." "He has a lawyer," Evelyn said. She was not arguing against the evidence. She was thinking through what came after it. If we confront him directly, he denies everything. The evidence gets disputed. The company's situation becomes public before we control the story, and his brother's legal team spend the next 2 years making this about us. She looked at Daniel. "How solid is the access log evidence on its own?" "Solid, but attackable," Daniel said carefully. "A good defense attorney argues the logs were manipulated, that someone used Victor's credentials without his knowledge, that the anomaly was introduced by a third party. It would be difficult to prove, but difficult and impossible are different things in a courtroom." He paused. "We need something unambiguous. something that removes the possibility of another explanation. Evelyn turned to look at the whiteboard. We need him to activate the sabotage himself. On record, with witnesses. Malik had been sitting quietly with his hands folded, looking at the floor in that way he had when he was working through something internally. He looked up. You want to let the demonstration happen? I want to use the demonstration, Evelyn said. There's a difference. Not to the cars, Malik said. If Victor activates that code during a live event, he won't be able to, she said. Not if the pathway is already severed. Victor gets to believe he is still in control, which means he stays in the building, stays calm, and makes his move exactly when we need him to make it. If we confront him now, we get a denial and a lawyer and a 2-year legal process. If we let him walk into the trap, we get a time-stamped activation attempt, a terminal trace, and a witness list. She said it steadily, not coldly. She had made hard decisions before. She had learned that the hardest ones were rarely the ones that felt hard. They were the ones that felt like the only option once you had looked at all the others. Because you'll have already isolated the trigger mechanism. The code stays in place, so Victor believes he still has control. But the actual pathway that allows it to activate gets cut. He presses his trigger. Nothing happens, except we capture exactly when he pressed it, from which terminal, with which credentials. Malik was quiet for a moment, running the problem in his mind the way he ran engine diagnostics. Not leaping to the answer, but tracing the pathway from the beginning. That's a precise piece of work. The code is designed to look dormant until activation. The self-check routine runs every time Victor accesses the system. It's essentially a heartbeat that confirms the mechanism is intact. Isolating the trigger without removing the surrounding code, without disturbing the routine, without tripping any flags that would tell Victor the pathway is compromised. He paused. It means the modification has to live in a part of the code the self-check never reads. Which means I need to understand this code well enough to know exactly where that space is. Another pause. It can be done, but it has to be done carefully, and it has to be done once. Can you do it? He looked at the whiteboard. I need access to the vehicle network in about 4 hours. Daniel glanced at Evelyn. She nodded once. You'll have both, he said. The question of motive had been settled by the evidence. The question of how Victor had obtained Malik's proprietary work from Meridian Drive Systems was still open, and it bothered Malik in the specific way that incomplete things bother people who are used to understanding problems fully before they move on. He raised it with Daniel, while Evelyn stepped out to take a call. Daniel pulled up Meridian's corporate history. Not difficult, since the company had been acquired 4 years ago and the records were public. He scrolled quietly, cross-referencing with Apex Motors' acquisition timeline. He stopped scrolling. Meridian Drive Systems was acquired by a holding company called Vantage Capital Partners 18 months after you left, Daniel said. Vantage Capital Partners has 2 major investors. He turned the laptop so Malik could see the screen. Robert Hale is one of them. Malik looked at the screen for a long moment. He bought the company that had your work, Daniel said quietly. He bought access to everything I built there, Malik said. Every file, every model, every line of code I wrote for 8 years. It was all sitting in Meridian's servers when Robert Hale's money walked through the door. The room was still. Malik sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not dramatically, just the way you look at something distant when the thing in front of you has just become considerably larger than you thought it was. For years, he had believed the collapse of his career at Meridian was a matter of bad luck meeting bad people. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people in charge. He had carried that understanding for 7 years, raising Aaliyah on it, building a smaller and quieter life around its edges. Now, he was looking at evidence that suggested it was never random, that someone had been watching Meridian, watching his work, watching the moment when it would become useful. He didn't just use Victor to sabotage Sterling Automotive, Malik said slowly. He spent years building the position to do it, acquiring the intellectual property, planting his brother inside the engineering department. He stopped. How long has Victor worked here? 7 years, Daniel said. Malik looked up. Robert Hale's acquisition attempt was 14 months ago. Victor was here 5.5 years before that offer was ever made. He let the implication settle. Victor was placed here long before anyone knew there would be a formal offer to reject. The acquisition was the polite version. This was always the backup plan. Evelyn came back into the room, and Malik told her. She listened without expression, standing near the door, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. 7 years, she said. Yes. She looked at the whiteboard. She looked at the sleeping child in the corner. Aaliyah, who had been brought into this building because her father had no child care and had ended up being one of the sharpest minds in every room she sat in. She looked at the timeline Daniel had drawn, a shape that had been a recent crime and was now something that had been growing for the better part of a decade. Victor Hale had been sitting in her meetings for 7 years. He had argued with her about timelines and safety margins and engineering trade-offs. He had been, she had believed, committed to building something genuinely excellent. And all of that time and competence and apparent loyalty had been infrastructure for this. She thought about what it meant that Malik had walked into her building with a cleaning cart and been the one to unravel it. Not her engineering team, not her operations team. A man she had asked a security guard not to throw out. Okay, she said. It was a small word for a large decision. We move forward. Malik isolates the trigger tonight. The demonstration stays on schedule. Victor activates, and we catch it on record. She paused. And when it's over, I want everything Meridian, Vantage Capital, Robert Hale, in front of the authorities. Agreed, Daniel said. Malik nodded. He looked over at Aaliyah, still asleep, breathing evenly. One more thing, he said. Victor ran that anomaly query this morning. He knows something flagged. He hasn't run yet, which means he either doesn't know how much we've found, or he's too committed to the timeline to pull back. Evelyn pulled out her phone and showed Malik and Daniel an intercept their IT security team had flagged that afternoon. A message to Victor's company email from a personal address associated with Robert Hale. Short and direct. Confirm status. Window closes in 48 hours. He's being pushed, Daniel said. He's going to try to activate early, Malik said. Before the demonstration, if the pressure keeps building. We can't wait 4 days. He looked at Evelyn. 2 days at most. Maybe less. Evelyn checked her watch. It was 9:40 in the evening. Then you start tonight. The engineering bay at night was a different place. The overhead lights ran at a third of their daytime intensity, leaving the prototype vehicles in a dim wash of yellow-white. The diagnostic station stayed on, green indicator lights blinking steadily in the quiet. Malik worked at the primary station connected to the vehicle network, moving through the code with the focused deliberateness he brought to everything. He had the printed logs beside him, his own notes from the past 2 days, annotated in the small, precise handwriting that had filled engineering notebooks for a decade before it had filled cleaning schedules. He moved between the printed page and the screen the way he moved between listening and looking, letting both inform each other, neither one enough on its own. Daniel sat nearby at a secondary station, monitoring the network logs in real time, watching for any sign that Victor had accessed the system remotely, any probe suggesting he was watching. It was quiet work and unglamorous work, and Daniel did it without complaint, refilling his coffee twice and making no sound except the occasional soft click of his keyboard confirming a log entry. The task required precision. The interference code sat inside the vehicle's software like a coiled thing, inactive, waiting for its trigger signal. What Malik needed to do was sever the connection between the trigger and the mechanism without disturbing anything the trigger could detect. If the code registered the pathway as broken, it would flag the change, and Victor would know the trap had been found. He worked for 2 hours without speaking much. Occasionally, he asked Daniel to confirm a network reading. Once he stopped completely for several minutes, hands still on the keyboard, studying a section of the code. Then he made 3 precise changes and moved on. Aaliyah had woken at 11, eaten half a sandwich Evelyn's assistant had left, and settled in the chair nearest to her father's workstation. She didn't interrupt. She watched the screens, and occasionally she watched the cars, and sometimes she watched the door. At midnight, Malik leaned back. Done, he said. Daniel ran the verification sequence. The interference code read as fully intact and active. The trigger pathway was severed in a location the code's own self-check routine would never reach. Victor could press his activation key, and the program would execute its launch sequence, log the attempt with full credentials and timestamp, and then stop at the severed pathway, silently, invisibly, producing nothing on the vehicle's end. The car would keep running. Victor would not know why. "It's clean," Daniel confirmed. Malik looked at the car beyond the screen, the Aurelius X9, sitting still in the dim bay, carrying the hidden code, and now, unknown to anyone who had put it there, carrying the trap. "Now we need to make sure Victor actually uses the trigger during the demonstration," Malik said. "If his brother's 48-hour window pushes him far enough, he tries tonight or tomorrow before the event. The demonstration is the right moment for him," Daniel said. "Maximum visibility. A private failure doesn't destroy the company the way a public one does." "Unless he panics," Malik said. They both considered the empty room and the cars in it and the man 3 floors up who was running out of time. The next morning moved quickly under the surface of a normal working day. Evelyn ran her 9 o'clock team meeting, reviewed the demonstration logistics, discussed the investor guest list with her communications team. Victor attended, asked 2 precise technical questions about the demonstration sequence, and left the room looking exactly as he always looked. But Malik, watching from the corridor through the glass partition, saw what he had seen on the first morning. That careful watchfulness, the expression of a man tracking a situation he believed he still controlled. Victor asked his technical questions with clean, professional confidence. He made a note on his tablet. He thanked Evelyn for the demonstration update. He walked out of the room without looking at the seat where Malik had been sitting the past 2 days, which was itself a kind of tell. People who are genuinely unbothered by something glance at it. People who are very carefully not thinking about something go out of their way not to look. Victor believed the code was intact. Victor believed the trigger was ready. He was walking toward a door he didn't know had been bricked up behind its frame, and he was doing it with the composed confidence of someone who had spent 7 years learning to look exactly like he was supposed to look. Daniel pulled Malik aside mid-morning. He had been monitoring Victor's system access overnight, and something had changed. He went into the vehicle network at 2:15 this morning, Daniel said quietly. After you'd finished, he accessed the interference code files, not to modify them. He ran a status check. Malik went still. Did he find the modification? No. The verification passes exactly as designed. Code reads active and intact. Daniel looked at him steadily. But he's checking. He's nervous. He got another message from his brother, Malik said. Daniel showed him the second intercept, flagged by IT security that morning. The message was 4 words: activate before the event. Robert Hale was pulling his brother off the cliff. He's going to try tonight, Malik said. Evelyn gathered the core team in the private office. Malik, Daniel, Diane, and Aaliyah, who had arrived from school and walked into the situation the way she always walked into things, without requiring an explanation. If he activates tonight, the trap captures the attempt, Daniel said. Credentials, timestamp, terminal ID. We need a witness chain, Evelyn said. An internal system log isn't enough if Robert Hale's lawyers argue manipulation. We need people present when it happens. Real-time witnesses. Malik was already thinking about the secondary issue. There's something else we haven't finished. Aaliyah found the signal was in every prototype in the building, not just the demonstration vehicles. We covered 3. The full fleet check needs to run. Evelyn looked at Diane. 2 hours, Diane said. Do it now, Evelyn said. While Diane worked through the fleet, Malik built the monitoring device he had been thinking about since the previous evening. It was simple in design. A small signal reading unit he calibrated to the specific electrical signature of Victor's activation trigger, connected to the engineering Bayes network node externally. Not just the system log, which lived inside the software and could theoretically be disputed. A hardware read of the trigger signal as it physically traveled, captured outside the system Victor's code existed in. Aaliyah sat beside him as he assembled it, handing him components when he reached, watching how they connected with the focused attention she gave to things she was learning by observation. It's like the listening, she said quietly. Except you're building something to listen for you. That's exactly what it is, Malik said. She tilted her head, studying the half-assembled device. When you listened to the X9, it was just you. You heard the signal and understood it, but there was no record. It was only in your head. She paused. So, this is for making the thing you already know into something other people can't argue with. Malik stopped what he was doing and looked at his daughter for a moment. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it's for. Aaliyah nodded slowly. She understood something about that, about the distance between knowing a thing and being believed about a thing. Her father had been living in that distance for 7 years. She handed him the next component without being asked. Diane came back with the results. 2 more vehicles, both in secured storage. Older platforms, not scheduled for any demonstrations, which was why they had been missed in the original sweep. Same interference architecture. Victor had been thorough. 5 vehicles, Evelyn said. She was quiet for a moment. He wasn't just targeting the investor event. He was building repeated failure into the entire fleet. Even if the first demonstration was stopped, even if we found the code and removed it from the prototype, another vehicle would fail at the next event, and the next, until the pattern became undeniable and the lawsuits started and the stock fell and Apex Motors came in with a low offer and a polite expression. Long enough to make the safety record irreparable, Daniel said. 3 failures, 4 failures. At that point, it doesn't matter whether we prove sabotage. The damage is done. Diane looked at the 5 vehicles on her screen with an expression that had moved past professional concern into something more personal. She had spent 6 years building these cars. She had run the interference check with her own hands. She thought about what it would mean for a driver at high speed to have an engine cut without warning and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Malik connected the monitoring device to the network node, ran a test cycle, and watched the small green indicator light respond cleanly. He set it in position and stepped back. The trap was complete. The device was live. All that remained was waiting for Victor Hale to do what his brother was demanding he do, and trusting that the careful, patient work of the past 2 days would hold when it mattered. Victor made his move at 11:17 that night. Malik knew the moment the monitoring device's indicator shifted from steady green to a rapid pulse. The activation trigger traveling through the network, hunting for the pathway that was no longer connected. He was in the engineering bay. Daniel sat at the diagnostic station. Evelyn stood near the door. The room was quiet, and the cars were still, and the trap had closed. Deactivated, Malik said. Daniel's screen showed the full log in real time. Timestamp, terminal ID, login credentials, the activation command executing in precise sequence. Victor Hale's credentials. Victor Hale's restricted laboratory terminal. Victor Hale's command, logged and time-stamped and sealed in 3 encrypted locations before the minute was out. The cars did not respond. The engines did not cut. The prototypes sat in the dim bay exactly as they had sat for the past 22 hours. Victor, 3 floors up in his restricted laboratory, would be looking at a screen showing no output from the activation. No signal acknowledgement. No confirmation from the vehicles. Just silence where there should have been a cascade. He would check his connection to the network. It was fine. He would verify his credentials, still valid, not revoked. He would look at the code sitting in the software system, reading as active and intact, heartbeat normal, self-check passing. And he would press the command again and again, staring at a program that told him it was working while the cars 3 floors below told him nothing at all. Beginning slowly and then all at once to understand that the silence was not a technical error, that the code had been found, that the trap had already closed around him while he was still deciding whether to run. He knows now, Malik said. Evelyn was already on the phone with building security, speaking quickly and precisely. Laboratory on the 3rd floor, the name, the room number, do not let him access the network terminals. Her voice was calm in the way it had been calm on the showroom floor 2 days ago, when the car had refused to start in front of 200 people. She had a gift for being calmest exactly when it mattered most. Daniel had already saved the system log to 3 separate encrypted locations, working with quick efficiency, not because he doubted the capture, but because evidence existed to be protected. He pulled the external log from the monitoring device as a 4th copy and transferred it to a separate drive. The monitoring device held the record, Trigger timestamp, pathway trace, terminal origin, signal strength. Every element of what Victor had done at 1117. Sitting in hardware that had never been connected to the network Victor had poisoned. Beyond the reach of any deletion or modification he might attempt in the minutes before security reached his laboratory door. Aaliyah, who was in the chair in the corner because nobody had told her to go home and she had fallen asleep there again, opened her eyes at the sound of movement. She looked at her father. He was watching the device's steady pulse, the small green light blinking calmly in the dark. "Did it work?" she asked. "It worked," he said. She looked at the cars. They were still and quiet and unharmed. "He's going to run. Security is already moving," Evelyn said from the doorway, phone still at her ear. Aaliyah pulled her jacket around her properly and sat up straight. The way you do when something that has been building for a long time has finally arrived at its end, and the room can finally breathe again, and you realize you have been holding something tight for so long you forgot you were holding it. She looked at her father. He was still watching the monitoring device, the small green light blinking steadily against the dark. His hands were loose at his sides. His expression was the one he had when a machine told him something true, quiet and certain, and a little bit relieved. "Good," she said. 2 days after Victor Hale's activation attempt logged silently into a hardware device he didn't know existed, Sterling Automotive's global investor demonstration went ahead exactly as scheduled. Evelyn had made that decision deliberately. Canceling would have raised questions she wasn't ready to answer publicly yet. Moving forward gave her something better: a stage, an audience, and the ability to control what that audience learned and when they learned it. The showroom had been reset since the failed launch earlier that week with the particular care of people who understood that the room itself had to communicate confidence. Additional seating had been arranged in curved rows facing the demonstration floor. Fresh flowers on the registration tables. Press credentials waiting in labeled envelopes. The Aurelius X9 sat at the center again. Same position, same lighting, looking exactly as it had before everything went sideways. Unhurried, expensive, and entirely unaware of the week it had just been through. 400 people filled the room. Investors who had flown back in, industry media, 2 automotive trade representatives, and a quiet cluster near the back that Evelyn's security team had been briefed on, but that nobody else in the room knew was there. They were not press. They were not investors. They listened to everything and wrote nothing down, which was its own kind of note-taking. Malik stood to the side of the vehicle, close enough to reach it. Aaliyah was beside him. She had her school bag on, which in the current circumstances felt almost absurd, except that she had insisted on bringing her homework because she had a project due and she was not going to let a corporate sabotage case affect her grades. The monitoring device was live and connected to the vehicle network, tucked into the equipment housing along the wall. Daniel was at the engineering station behind the presentation area, screens open, witness to every system read. Diane stood with her team near the far wall. She had said very little since learning the full scope of what Victor had built inside her cars. She was one of the best technicians Evelyn had ever employed, and the knowledge that code had lived in her vehicles undetected for months had settled on her like a weight she was still learning to carry. Victor Hale was not in the building. Building security had reached his laboratory within 9 minutes of Evelyn's call on the night of the activation attempt. The door had been unlocked. The lights were on. His monitor showed a terminated session, logged out in a hurry. His coffee was still warm on the desk. His car was gone from the parking structure. He had not returned his key card or his access badge or the engineering bay master key that every chief engineer kept on a hook inside their office door. An alert had gone to the police that same night, and an investigation had been opened quietly. Quietly because Evelyn had asked for 2 more days before the situation became public, because 2 days was enough time to prepare, and because silence, she had learned that week, was its own kind of preparation. What Victor did not know, because he had left before he could learn it, was that his activation attempt had been captured in full. He didn't know about the monitoring device. He didn't know about the 3 encrypted copies of the system log. He didn't know that the evidence against him was already in the hands of Evelyn's legal team, and that everything he had spent 7 years building inside Sterling Automotive had been turned into the case against him. He had run from a trap that had already closed. Evelyn opened the presentation with the same confidence she always carried. Not performed, not borrowed, simply hers. She acknowledged the disruption from the earlier launch event with the directness she brought to everything. A technical issue had been identified and resolved. The company's engineering team had worked through it with the help of an outside consultant whose instincts had proven exceptionally valuable. She nodded toward Malik. A few people in the audience looked over, curious, and looked back at her. "Today I want to show you the Aurelius X9, running the way it was built to run," she said. "And then I want to tell you something about this company that I think you should hear directly from me." She walked to the driver's side of the car and opened the door. Malik closed his eyes. He listened. The room was full of murmuring voices and the low sounds of event equipment and 200 people breathing, and underneath all of it, if you listen the right way, was the electrical hum of the car's pre-ignition system cycling, clean and steady and entirely different from what he had heard standing in this building 4 days ago. He opened his eyes. He looked at Aaliyah. She gave him a small nod. She had heard it too. Evelyn pressed the ignition button. The Aurelius X9 started with the sound of something that had been built to do exactly this, deep and immediate, filling the showroom with a presence that made several people in the front row straighten in their seats. The engine settled into a smooth idle. Every instrument lit correctly. Nothing hesitated. The audience applauded. Evelyn let it run for a moment. Then she got out of the car and walked to the podium at the front of the room, and the expression on her face shifted into something different from the polished presentation mode she had been in a moment before. "I want to be honest with you," she said. The applause faded. The room listened. She told them. Not everything. Not the full legal complexity, not Victor's name yet, because that was still being handled through the proper channels, but the shape of it. That the failure at the earlier launch was not engineering error. That it was deliberate interference, inserted by someone with executive-level access, designed to destroy the company's public credibility before a critical deal announcement. That the same interference had been found in 5 vehicles across the fleet. That it had been identified, documented, and neutralized not by her engineering team alone, but with the help of a man who had walked into this building 3 days ago as a cleaning contractor and heard what trained engineers had missed. She looked at Malik again. This time more people in the room looked over and didn't look back. This company was targeted because someone believed it could be destroyed, Evelyn said. "I want you to know that they were wrong. I also want you to know who helped prove it." She did not introduce him from the podium. That wasn't the kind of thing Malik would have wanted. Instead, after the formal presentation ended and the room broke into the organized milling of an event transitioning to networking, Evelyn walked to where Malik was standing and said his name clearly to the cluster of investors who had moved toward her immediately. "Malik Carter," she said, "former automotive engineer, current consultant to Sterling Automotive." The last part was news to Malik. He let it stand. The questions came quickly. He answered the technical ones directly and the biographical ones briefly, and the questions that were really requests to confirm that something unusual had happened. Yes, he had heard the interference pattern through a door in a service corridor. Yes, he had identified the fault without opening the hood. Yes, his daughter had noticed the signal interval before any of the diagnostic equipment had flagged it. He kept his answers precise and factual, because precision and fact were what the room needed, and also because he was not comfortable being the center of it. One of the investors, a woman in a charcoal blazer who had been listening from the edge of the group, asked him what he had actually heard that the engineers had missed. He thought about how to answer that honestly. "They were listening for a fault," he said. "I was just listening. When you look for a specific thing, you can miss the thing that's actually there." Aaliyah, standing beside him, accepted the attention directed at her with a 9-year-old's particular combination of composure and complete indifference to whether adults were impressed by her. She answered the questions asked of her with accurate brevity and then returned her attention to internal matters. She had a project due Thursday. At the back of the room, near the door that led to the east atrium, Daniel's phone lit up. He looked at the screen. He crossed the room to where Evelyn was standing and showed her the message quietly. Victor Hale had been located. Police had found him at an airport 3 states away, at a gate for a flight that had not yet boarded. He was being detained. His brother Robert Hale had been served with a formal investigation notice from federal authorities an hour earlier. the Meridian Drive Systems acquisition, the Vantage capital structure, the documented communications to Victor's company email were all part of a package that Evelyn's legal team had spent the past 2 days preparing. Evelyn read the message. She handed the phone back. She turned and looked at the room, the investors asking questions, the press recording, the car running cleanly in the center of everything. The engineering team standing at the edge of the floor with expressions that had moved from the shock of the past week into something that was beginning to look like relief. She looked at Malik. He was answering a question from a silver-haired man in a gray suit who was leaning forward with the focused attention of someone who had spent a career identifying things that were worth paying attention to. Malik was explaining something about the sound a starter motor makes when it receives power correctly versus when the signal is being interrupted. He was using his hands slightly as he talked, the way you do when you're describing something you can hear in your memory. He looked, in that moment, exactly like what he was, someone who understood machines in a way that was part knowledge and part something that couldn't be taught. 3 weeks after the investor demonstration, news of the Sterling Automotive sabotage was public in the way that large corporate stories become public, everywhere and all at once, cycling through financial news, automotive media, and the kind of general interest coverage that happens when a story has a villain, a hero, and a 9-year-old who noticed a 3.2-second signal interval. Aaliyah found the coverage deeply unnecessary. She had a new project due and a book report and a math test that she felt prepared for, but not as prepared as she wanted to be, and the story kept appearing on her classmates' parents' phones and resulting in conversations she did not particularly want to have. One kid in her class had told her his father said she was famous. She had explained that she was not famous. She had noticed a repeating interval in a waveform, and the kid had looked at her the way kids look at people who correct them with facts they didn't ask for. Sterling Automotive stock, which had dipped sharply in the days following the failed launch, recovered and then climbed past its pre-launch position within the first week after the demonstration. The global expansion deal that had been the reason for the investor event closed at terms favorable to Sterling Automotive. Apex Motors was under federal investigation for corporate espionage, fraud, and conspiracy charges that were still being assembled but were, by all legal accounts, substantial. Victor Hale had been extradited and was cooperating with investigators, which his attorney had advised him to do given the weight of the documented evidence against him. Robert Hale had retained a legal team that was expensive and aggressive, which suggested he had been expecting this possibility and had planned for it in advance. The planning had not, so far, been sufficient. Evelyn met with Malik in her actual office this time. Not the small after-hours room with the whiteboard, but the main office on the executive floor with windows that looked out over the city on 2 sides. She had coffee, and he had coffee, and she asked him the question she had been holding since the night of the activation, when she had watched him stand in the engineering bay in the half-dark and tell her it had worked. Why didn't you become one of the world's great engineers? Malik looked at his coffee. I was on that path, he said. I genuinely believed the work I was doing at Meridian was going to matter. Not just technically. I thought it would make vehicles safer. The diagnostic software I built was designed to catch interference patterns before they reached the road, before someone got hurt. He paused. When the company used my career to protect itself from a safety problem I'd found, I understood something I hadn't understood before. Being right isn't enough. Being good at something isn't enough. You need people with power to choose to stand behind what you've built. He looked at her. I had a daughter to raise, and I couldn't afford to spend years fighting a battle I didn't have the resources to win. So I put the work down. I thought I was putting it down permanently. But you didn't, Evelyn said. You heard that car through a door. Some things don't leave you, he said, even when you try to leave them. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. And now, Malik said, someone actually stood behind it. Evelyn had been thinking about the offer since before the demonstration. She made it directly. I want you as head of experimental engineering, she said. Not consulting, not temporary. Your work here, the diagnostic approach, the listening methodology, the monitoring device you built in one evening, all of it points toward a category of engineering that this company doesn't have yet and should. You be building it. Malik looked out the window. The city ran in both directions below. All the years of it, the cleaning shifts and the school pickups, in the apartment and the car with the uneven heater tick he had never fixed. "I haven't been in an engineering role in 7 years," he said. "I know. My credentials are from a company that discredited them publicly. That company is now owned by a man under federal investigation," Evelyn said. "The discrediting has been discredited." Malik almost smiled. He looked at his hands on the table, hands that had pushed a janitor's cart through this building 4 days ago and had, in the same week, quietly disarmed code that could have killed people. "I have one condition," he said. "Name it." "Aaliyah gets access to the engineering lab whenever she wants." He paused. "She's going to need somewhere to work in a few years. I'd rather she starts learning in the right place." Evelyn considered this for approximately half a second. "Done." Months later, the experimental engineering division of Sterling Automotive occupied a newly renovated space on the second floor, quieter than the main engineering bay, with a layout that Malik had designed himself over 3 evenings on graph paper and that the facilities team had found slightly unusual but had built without complaint. The acoustic panels on the walls were his idea. So were the monitoring stations that could listen to a running vehicle's electrical signature in real time and render it as a visual waveform on a large display. So was the rule, informal, never written down, simply understood, that a diagnostic scan was never the first step. The first step was always listening. There were 4 engineers on the team. All 4 had been chosen not only for their technical qualifications, but for a quality that was harder to define and easier to observe. They were the kind of people who stayed quiet when something was strange, letting the strangeness tell them what it was before they started explaining it away. And on one wall, mounted at exactly the right height for a 9-year-old standing beside her father, there was a small secondary monitor connected to the vehicle network. Aaliyah came in twice a week after school. She did her homework at the workstation nearest her father's, and when the homework was done, she watched the waveforms. She was learning the sounds. Late one evening, when most of the building had gone quiet and the overhead lights had dimmed to their maintenance setting, Malik stood beside a new prototype, an early-stage development vehicle, not yet named, that had been brought in that afternoon for its first system check. He pressed the test ignition. The engine ran, clean and steady, the waveform on his monitor moving in smooth, even peaks. Then something in the pattern shifted, barely, the kind of thing that wouldn't show as a fault code for days, and Malik's head tilted slightly to the left. He had been here before, standing still, listening. Aaliyah, sitting at her secondary monitor 10 feet away, had gone still too. She was looking at the waveform on her screen with the expression she had, the one that meant something had become specific. "Dad," she said, "I hear it." She tilted her head. "It's trying to tell us something." Malik looked at the engine, at the waveform, at his daughter, who had inherited the thing he had always carried and was now learning what to do with it in a room that was finally built for exactly this. "Then let's listen," he said. "If the people who failed you had simply listened, would you have spent years believing your best work was behind you? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more where this came from.